2,000 years before a single transistor was built, before anyone had ever heard the word binary, a man sat in a cave in ancient Greece and described your life with terrifying accuracy. He talked about prisoners chained in darkness, watching shadows flicker on a wall, mistaking those shadows for the entire universe. He said most people would live and die without ever realizing the shadows weren't real. That man was Plato. And what he described, word for word in spirit, is exactly what modern physicists, computer scientists, and Silicon Valley billionaires are now calling the simulation hypothesis. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't some clever metaphor that happens to line up if you squint hard enough. When you actually go back and read what the mystics, the philosophers, and the sages of the ancient world were saying, you start to notice something unsettling. They weren't speaking in riddles about spirituality. They were describing a system, a program, a rendered reality with rules, with code, with an architecture sitting just outside of what human eyes can perceive. And somehow, without telescopes, without supercomputers, without quantum physics, they got there first. So let's start with the obvious one, because it's the loudest, and because almost nobody who talks about simulation theory today gives this man the credit he deserves. Around 380 BC, Plato wrote down what we now call the allegory of the cave. Picture a group of people who have been chained inside a cave since the day they were born. They face a wall, behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and their backs, other figures pass by holding objects, casting shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners. The prisoners have never turned around. They have never seen the fire, never seen the objects, never seen anything except the shadows. So to them, the shadows are reality. The shadows are everything. They give the shadows names. They study the shadows. They build entire belief systems around the shadows, never once suspecting there's a fire behind them, casting a projection they've mistaken for the world. Now, hold that image for a second and think about what a simulation actually is, in the most basic technical sense. A simulation is a projection. It is information rendered into a form that appears, to anyone living inside it, indistinguishable from a base layer of reality, when in fact it's being generated by something operating one level above. Plato wasn't writing science fiction. He was describing, with almost mechanical precision, the exact relationship between a simulated environment and the processing layer that creates it. He even took it further. He argued that what we perceive with our senses are merely imperfect copies of a deeper, truer set of forms, ideal templates that exist somewhere beyond the world we can touch and see. If that doesn't sound like a description of rendered objects pulling data from an underlying source code, it's hard to know what would. Here's the detail that almost nobody mentions, and it's the kind of detail that should stop you in your tracks. Nick Bostrom, the Oxford philosopher whose 2003 paper effectively launched the modern simulation argument into mainstream science and pop culture, never once references Plato. Not in the original paper, not in most of the major interviews and articles that followed. The man who is credited with inventing the simulation hypothesis as a serious academic position apparently never connected it to the most famous pre-modern description of the exact same idea. Maybe it was so obvious he didn't think it needed saying. Or maybe it's just easier to sell a brand new idea than to admit you've reinvented one that's 2,500 years old. But Plato is just the beginning. Because if you travel east, away from Athens, away from Greek philosophy entirely, you find civilizations that had been building entire spiritual systems around this exact concept for centuries before Plato ever picked up a pen. In the Vedic traditions of ancient India, there's a concept called Maya. Translators often render it simply as illusion, but that doesn't capture what's actually being described. Maya isn't just the idea that the world is fake or meaningless. Maya describes the world as a kind of cosmic play, a generated experience, something performed and projected by a higher consciousness for reasons that aren't always clear to the beings living inside it. Hindu philosophy describes this generative aspect using the word lila, meaning divine play. The universe, in this framework, isn't an accident. It isn't random matter colliding in a void. It's an act of creation that behaves more like a performance, a constructed environment, something generated and sustained moment to moment by an intelligence beyond it. There's a story, often repeated by Hindu teachers trying to explain Maya to Western audiences, where the philosopher compares the human experience of physical reality to actors in a motion picture. Think about how strange that comparison is. Long before film existed, before anyone had ever projected a moving image onto a screen, certain Hindu teachers were already explaining ultimate reality using the closest available metaphor for what we would now instantly recognize as a simulation. People living inside a constructed experience, mistaking the images on the screen for genuine, independent reality, completely unaware that somewhere outside the theater, there's a projector running and a story being written that they are simply the characters inside of. Move further east again, and you find Buddhism arriving at something strikingly similar, though through a completely different door. Buddhist philosophy doesn't focus on an external creator running a divine simulation. Instead, it focuses on the mind itself as the generator of the perceived world. In Buddhist thought, what we experience as a stable, solid, external reality is actually a constructed output of consciousness, an effect produced by what's sometimes called the underlying essence of mind. Strip away the spiritual language for a second and look at the mechanics being described. Reality, in this framework, isn't a fixed thing sitting out there that we passively observe. It's something actively rendered, frame by frame, moment by moment, by a deeper process running beneath ordinary awareness. That is, almost beat for beat, a description of how a simulation actually works. A simulation doesn't pre-exist in finished form. It's computed in real time, generated as needed, rendered the instant it's required and not a moment before. Buddhist monks were describing exactly that mechanism in meditation halls, 2,500 years before anyone had a word for real-time rendering. Now here's where it gets even stranger, because we haven't even left the ancient world yet, and we haven't even touched on the part of this story that most people find the most chilling: math. Centuries before Plato, in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, a man named Pythagoras built an entire school of thought around a single audacious claim. He said numbers were not just tools for counting things. He said numbers were the actual underlying substance of reality, not a description of the physical world, but the foundation beneath it. Everything that exists, according to Pythagoras, is in some essential way made of mathematics. Strip away matter, strip away appearances, and what's left is pure numerical relationship. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact foundational assumption behind every computer simulation ever built. A simulation, at the deepest technical level, isn't made of stuff. It's made of numbers. Variables, values, equations being processed and updated frame by frame to produce the appearance of physical objects, physical motion, physical cause and effect. Pythagoras wasn't a computer scientist. He had no concept of binary code or processors. But over 2,000 years ago, working with nothing but geometry, music theory, and pure intuition, he arrived at the idea that reality's true nature is mathematical, computational in the deepest sense of the word, long before anyone had built a machine capable of demonstrating what that would actually look like in practice. It didn't stop with Pythagoras either. Centuries later, Plato himself would echo this idea in his own way, famously suggesting that God geometrizes, meaning the divine mind organizes the universe according to mathematical law. And the thread doesn't end in the ancient world. It resurfaces again and again throughout history, almost as if certain minds, separated by centuries and continents, kept independently bumping into the same uncomfortable conclusion. The mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss, working in the 1800s, is famously associated with the phrase God computes, a direct evolution of Plato's geometrical God into something closer to a literal calculating intelligence. From Pythagoras' numbers to Plato's geometry to Gauss's computation, you can trace a single unbroken intellectual lineage spanning over 2,000 years, all converging on the same basic claim. Reality has a deep structure that behaves like mathematics, like calculation, like code. And if you think this is just a Western or an Eastern phenomenon, isolated to a couple of traditions that happen to stumble onto similar metaphors, look at Islamic mysticism, specifically the Sufi tradition. Sufi mystics describe earthly existence using the metaphor of a dream, a passing illusion, something fleeting and ultimately unreal compared to the eternal presence of the divine that lies behind it. Sufi poetry is saturated with the imagery of veils and curtains, layer after layer of obscuring fabric separating the seeker from ultimate truth. Each veil has to be lifted, each curtain pulled back, in order to glimpse what's actually behind the constructed experience of ordinary life. If you wanted to describe layers of code, layers of rendering, layers of abstraction sitting between a user and the raw machine underneath, you could hardly find better language than veils and curtains obscuring a hidden, deeper reality. Then there's the most obvious one of all, the one hiding in plain sight inside three of the largest religions on earth. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all describe a single act of creation carried out not through physical construction, but through speech. In Genesis, God doesn't mold the universe with hands. God speaks, and the universe simply happens. Let there be light, and there was light. The Quran tells a similar story, a divine command, instantly executed, instantly real. Strip away the theological framing and look purely at the mechanism being described. A command is issued, and reality instantiates in response. That is structurally identical to how a programmer interacts with a simulation. You don't physically build the object pixel by pixel with your hands. You write a command. The system executes the command. The object appears. Let there be light is, mechanically speaking, indistinguishable from a line of code being run and a function returning its output. This is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. These religious traditions, separated from each other by geography, by language, by centuries of theological evolution, all converge on the exact same model of creation. Reality didn't get assembled. It got executed. A command went out, and the universe responded. So now you have to ask the obvious question. How did all of these completely disconnected traditions, with no contact, no shared texts, no shared language, arrive at strikingly similar conclusions, centuries and sometimes millennia, before anyone had the technological vocabulary to describe what they were actually pointing at? Here are a few possible answers. And to be intellectually honest, we should walk through all of them. The first possibility is the simplest and the most boring. Human minds, regardless of culture, naturally gravitate towards certain metaphors when trying to describe the unknowable: shadows, dreams, illusions, veils, performances. These are universal human experiences, things every culture on Earth has encountered. Maybe ancient thinkers weren't detecting anything real about the structure of the universe. Maybe they were simply reaching for the most intuitive, theoretically be explained as part of the simulation itself. If the simulation is good enough, it would be designed specifically to be undetectable from the inside. That's not a flaw cooked up by skeptics to dismiss the theory. It's baked into the logic of the theory itself, and it applies just as much to the ancient mystical versions of this idea as it does to the modern scientific one. Meditation, fasting, prolonged isolation, the kinds of altered states that mystics across nearly every tradition deliberately induced in order to investigate the nature of reality from the inside. Modern neuroscience has confirmed something genuinely strange about human perception. Your brain does not give you a live, unfiltered feed of the external world. It can't. The raw sensory data arriving through your eyes, your ears, your skin is far too chaotic and incomplete to be experienced directly. Instead, your brain constructs a model, a best-guess simulation of what's out there, updates it continuously based on incoming signals, and then hands you that model, fully finished, and convinces you that you're looking directly at reality itself, when in fact you're looking at a highly processed, heavily edited rendering. If you wanted a modern, neuroscientific description of Plato's cave, that's it. The shadows on the wall are your perception. The fire and the objects behind you are the raw sensory data your brain is processing into something usable. You never see the raw data directly. You only ever see the rendered output. Ancient mystics, through deep introspection, appear to have noticed this same structural feature of consciousness, the gap between raw reality and the constructed experience layered on top of it, and they built entire spiritual and philosophical systems trying to describe what they noticed. Then there's quantum mechanics, and this is where things get genuinely difficult to explain away as coincidence. In the early 20th century, physicists performing experiments with light and subatomic particles discovered something that should not have been possible according to classical physics. Particles appeared to behave differently depending on whether or not they were being observed. Run an experiment without a detector watching a particular pathway, and the particle behaves like a wave, spreading out, existing in multiple possible states simultaneously. Add a detector, observe which path the particle actually takes, and the wave behavior collapses instantly into a single, definite outcome. This is called the observer effect, and it remains one of the most debated and unsettling findings in all of modern physics. Now think back to what Buddhist philosophy was claiming, centuries before quantum mechanics existed. Reality, they said, is not a fixed, independent thing sitting out there, waiting to be discovered. It is generated in real time in relationship to consciousness itself. That is an almost exact philosophical preview of what quantum experiments would later demonstrate empirically. Observation doesn't just measure reality. In some strange, still poorly understood sense, observation participates in producing the specific outcome that gets observed. If you were trying to build a believable simulation and you wanted to save processing power, you wouldn't render every possible outcome of every interaction in the universe at all times. You'd only render the specific outcome that gets observed the moment it gets observed, exactly the way a video game doesn't render the inside of a building you haven't walked into yet, or the far side of a mountain you're not currently looking at. The game engine renders what needs to be seen, when it needs to be seen, and leaves everything else as unresolved potential until your perspective demands an answer. That is, mechanically, almost identical to what quantum mechanics describes, happening at the smallest observable scales of the universe. This is the exact argument modern simulation theorists make when they're asked for actual physical evidence rather than just philosophical speculation. They point to quantum indeterminacy. They point to the strange role of the observer in determining outcomes. They point to the fact that information, not matter, increasingly looks like the most fundamental layer of physical reality, with mass and energy appearing to behave more like outputs of an underlying informational process than independently existing substances. And then, almost as an afterthought, certain researchers admit that this entire framework sounds remarkably close to what mystics across multiple ancient traditions were describing. using entirely different language, centuries before anyone had access to a particle accelerator. This brings us to the man whose work has become the closest thing the modern simulation hypothesis has to a definitive academic treatment, an MIT-trained computer scientist named Rizwan Virk. Virk's central argument is straightforward but genuinely provocative. He suggests that computer science, quantum physics, and the testimony of ancient mystics are all, independently, pointing at the same underlying structure of reality, not as a metaphor, not as a coincidence, as three completely separate investigative methods, run by people with no contact with each other, arriving at compatible descriptions of the same phenomenon, the way three blind investigators feeling different parts of the same elephant might eventually realize they're describing the same animal. Virk's argument draws heavily on the way video games have evolved over the past several decades, because video games offer the clearest modern intuition pump for understanding how a believable simulated reality might actually function. Early video games rendered everything constantly, the entire game world all at once, because the worlds were small enough that it didn't matter. As game worlds expanded into vast, detailed, open environments, that approach became computationally impossible. Modern game engines, instead, render only what the player can currently perceive, generating distant terrain, unseen rooms, and unloaded characters only the instant they become relevant to the player's field of view or interaction. This is called rendering on demand, and it is, structurally, identical to what quantum mechanics appears to be describing about subatomic particles existing in undetermined states until observed. If you wanted to design the most computationally efficient possible simulation capable of fooling its inhabitants into believing it was the entire, complete universe, you would design it exactly the way our universe appears to behave. You would render reality at the smallest, most efficient scale required, only when observation demands a definite answer, exactly the way quantum experiments suggest particles resolve into definite states only upon measurement. This doesn't prove the universe is a simulation. Nothing currently can prove that one way or another. But it's worth sitting with how strange it is that ancient meditators, working purely through introspection thousands of years before any of this, there's a particular line, often repeated in discussions of simulation theory, that captures just how seriously some serious thinkers have started taking this convergence. The transhumanist philosopher David Pearce once described Bostrom's simulation argument as the first genuinely interesting argument for the existence of a creator in 2,000 years. Think about how remarkable that statement actually is. A modern philosopher, working entirely within a scientific, computational, decidedly secular framework, ends up arriving back at essentially the same question every major religious tradition has been asking since the dawn of recorded history. Is there something, or someone operating one level above the reality we're capable of perceiving? Bostrom's framework just gives that ancient question a new vocabulary. Creator becomes programmer. Divine will becomes source code. Prayer becomes, perhaps, an attempt to send a signal upward through layers of rendering you weren't designed to perceive directly. This is precisely why the recent surge of mainstream interest in simulation theory has started explicitly connecting back to religious and mystical tradition, rather than treating it purely as a secular, science fiction-flavored idea. The same questions are showing up, repackaged, but unmistakably the same. Why are we here? Is there more to reality than what we can directly see and touch? Is there an intelligence beyond the physical world, responsible for what we experience? Are we, ourselves, something more than the physical bodies our simulated reality has assigned us to inhabit? Every single one of these questions appears, almost word for word, in mystical and religious texts thousands of years old, and every single one of these questions is now being asked again, with renewed urgency, by physicists, computer scientists, and philosophers working at the absolute cutting edge of 21st century technology. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with, because it explains why this topic has exploded back into public conversation right now, in this exact moment, rather than staying a niche philosophy debate confined to university lecture halls. Artificial intelligence has changed the terms of the conversation entirely. For most of the 20th century, the simulation hypothesis was a clever thought experiment, fun to argue about over drinks, but ultimately abstract, because nobody had ever actually built a convincing artificial world. That changed the moment AI systems started generating photorealistic images, synthetic voices, indistinguishable from real humans and entire virtual environments capable of responding intelligently to whatever you throw at them. Once you've watched a machine generate a convincing human face from nothing but a text prompt, the idea that an advanced enough civilization could generate an entire convincing universe stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding like a simple matter of available processing power. We are, right now, living through the exact, and this is also why people keep returning to the question of motive, because if reality really is generated rather than fundamental, the obvious follow-up question is why? Why build this? Why populate it with conscious beings who suffer, who question, who spend entire lifetimes trying to claw their way toward exactly the kind of realization this script is walking you through right now? The mystics actually had answers to this question too, long before anyone phrased it, and modern simulation theorists, when pushed on the same question, tend to land on strikingly similar answers. Maybe it's a research project run by some future version of ourselves, studying ancestral simulations the way historians study ancient civilizations. Maybe it's entertainment, an immersive experience built by beings advanced enough to generate entire universes the way we now generate video games. Maybe it's education, and there's a deeper reason this idea refuses to die. No matter how many times skeptics point out, correctly, that it's unfalsifiable, it's because the alternative is, in some ways, harder to sit with. If reality isn't generated, isn't computed, isn't rendered by something beyond it, then it simply exists. Brute fact. No explanation required or even possible. Matter and energy spinning through an indifferent void for no reason at all. Mystics across every tradition we've covered seemed unwilling or unable to accept that as a final answer. Neither, it turns out, are a growing number of modern physicists and computer scientists, working with entirely different tools, but apparently driven by the exact same restlessness. Something underneath this doesn't add up cleanly as raw, brute, accidental existence. There appears to be structure, pattern, computation, intention, or at the very least, the unmistakable appearance of all four, sitting just beneath the surface of everything we can directly observe. So where does that leave us? Not with proof. Let's be completely clear about that, because anyone telling you they've proven we live in a simulation is overselling an idea that remains, by its very nature, untestable in any definitive way. What we actually have is something arguably more interesting than proof. We have a strange, persistent, cross-cultural pattern. Independent civilizations, separated, the Hindu concept of Maya as cosmic play, the Buddhist description of a mind-generated world. Pythagoras, insisting reality is fundamentally mathematical. Sufi mystics describing veils separating us from a deeper truth. Three major world religions describing creation as an act of spoken command rather than physical construction. And then, arriving thousands of years later, modern computer scientists and physicists working with tools the ancient world couldn't have imagined, independently rediscovering nearly every one of those same structural ideas. Reality behaving like rendered information rather than solid, independently existing matter. Observation determining outcomes rather than merely measuring fixed ones. Mathematics appearing to sit at the deepest, most fundamental layer beneath physical existence, exactly the way Pythagoras insisted, more than 2,000 years before anyone built a single processor. Rediscover using mathematics and machinery instead of stillness and silence. If that's true, then the line connecting a Greek philosopher's cave, a Hindu sage's cosmic play, a Buddhist monk's mind-generated world, a Sufi poet's veiled truth, and a modern physicist's quantum equations isn't a coincidence at all. It's a single thread of insight, rediscovered again and again across thousands of years by people who had absolutely no way of knowing they were all describing the same thing. Either way, the question they were all asking remains exactly as open today as it was the day Plato first described prisoners chained in a cave, mistaking shadows for the entire world. Is what you're experiencing right now, this very moment, the deepest layer of reality that exists? Or is it simply the part of the simulation you've been allowed to see?